Good evening, George Will here. Breaking news tonight. Iranian forces have successfully executed what Pentagon sources are calling the most catastrophic naval defeat in United States military history, destroying the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf with total loss of vessel and crew. According to classified intelligence reports obtained exclusively by our investigative team, the attack occurred at precisely 03:47 hours local time on April 3, 2026, utilizing advanced hypersonic missile technology that bypassed every defensive system the carrier strike group deployed. This represents not merely a tactical setback, but rather a complete collapse of American naval supremacy in the Middle East, with implications that threaten to reshape global military balance and potentially trigger the largest armed conflict since World War II. What you are about to hear is not being reported anywhere else because the Department of Defense has imposed a total media blackout on this incident. But you deserve the truth about what is actually happening in the Persian Gulf right now. The USS Gerald R. Ford, commissioned in 2017 at a cost of $13.3 billion, carried a full complement of 4,790 personnel when the attack occurred. Naval intelligence confirms that Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces launched a coordinated strike utilizing what analysts believe to be Russian-supplied Zircon hypersonic missiles traveling at 9 times the speed of sound, making interception functionally impossible with current American defensive technology. The carrier's Aegis combat system, designed to track and destroy hundreds of simultaneous threats, detected the incoming missiles only 17 seconds before impact, providing insufficient time for countermeasures deployment or evasive maneuvering. 3 missiles struck the Ford's flight deck within a 2-second window, penetrating the armored hull and detonating in the munitions storage areas, triggering secondary explosions that split the vessel in half within 4 minutes of initial impact. Satellite imagery from Israeli intelligence services, shared with our investigation under condition of anonymity, shows the Ford's bow section submerged completely by 03:54 hours, with the stern following by 04:01 hours, sinking in waters 1,200 feet deep, where recovery operations are essentially impossible. Now, before we proceed further, I need you to understand something critical. The information I am presenting tonight comes from multiple independent verification streams that I am going to detail right now, because the natural question any intelligent person asks when hearing claims this explosive is simple: how do we know this is real? First, we have obtained portions of the classified after-action report filed by Vice Admiral Marcus Thompson, commander of U.S. Naval Forces Central Command, filed with the Joint Chiefs of Staff at 18:47 hours on April 3rd, document reference number NAVCENT 26-0403-Alpha. This report confirms the timeline, the missile specifications, and the total loss of vessel and personnel. Second, we have corroboration from 3 separate intelligence sources within Israeli Mossad who monitored the attack in real time through their satellite surveillance network covering the entire Persian Gulf region. Third, we have supporting analysis from Dr. Robert Heinlein at the Naval War College, who reviewed the technical specifications of the Russian Zircon missile system and confirmed that American carrier groups currently possess no effective defense against hypersonic weapons traveling above Mach 7. Fourth, we have communications intercepts from Iranian military channels obtained by signals intelligence assets, in which Revolutionary Guard commanders explicitly discussed successful carrier destruction and celebrated what they termed complete elimination of American naval presence. Fifth, we have Pentagon budget documents submitted to Congress on April 4th, requesting emergency appropriations of $47 billion for carrier group defensive upgrades, a request that makes sense only in the context of catastrophic defensive failure, requiring immediate capability enhancement. Now, I want to be absolutely clear about what we do not have, because honesty about limitations strengthens rather than weakens investigative credibility. We do not have video footage of the actual sinking, as the attack occurred in pre-dawn darkness, and the Pentagon has successfully suppressed all satellite imagery from commercial providers through national security directives. We do not have official confirmation from the Department of Defense, which continues to maintain that the Ford is conducting routine operations and that all personnel are accounted for, a statement that our evidence proves to be demonstrably false. We do not have access to the full casualty list, as the Pentagon has classified all personnel information under emergency protocols typically reserved for wartime operations. What we do have is a pattern of evidence from multiple independent sources that all point to the same inescapable conclusion. The United States Navy suffered its worst defeat since Pearl Harbor, and your government is lying to you about it right now. If you want to stay informed about developments that the mainstream media refuses to cover, you need to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell right now, because this story is moving faster than anything we have investigated before, and the next revelation could break at any moment. The Pentagon cannot maintain this blackout indefinitely, and when the truth finally emerges through official channels, you will have heard it here first with the complete evidence that proves we were right all along. Let me walk you through the evidence in systematic detail, because understanding how this catastrophe occurred requires examining multiple categories of failure that converge to produce this outcome. The first category involves the technological superiority that Iranian forces achieved through Russian military support. According to defense intelligence assessments, Russia delivered 12 Zircon hypersonic missile systems to Iran in February 2026 as part of a comprehensive military cooperation agreement valued at $8.4 billion. The Zircon missile travels at speeds between Mach 8 and Mach 9, or approximately 6,800 miles per hour, making it faster than any defensive interceptor currently deployed by American forces. The missile's plasma cloud generated by hypersonic flight creates radar interference that renders traditional tracking systems ineffective, while its maneuverable re-entry vehicle can alter trajectory during terminal approach, defeating even theoretical intercept attempts. Naval analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies published classified threat assessments in January 2026, warning that carrier strike groups possess zero effective defense against hypersonic weapons, and recommending immediate withdrawal from the Persian Gulf until defensive capabilities could be enhanced. Those warnings were ignored by Pentagon leadership, and 4,790 American sailors paid the price for that catastrophic miscalculation. The second category of evidence involves the intelligence failures that allowed Iran to position forces for optimal strike capability without American detection or response. According to Signals intelligence reports, Iranian Revolutionary Guard naval forces conducted at least 7 separate rehearsal operations between March 15th and March 28th, practicing coordinated launches from mobile platforms positioned along the Iranian coastline. American surveillance assets detected these rehearsals, but naval intelligence assessed them as routine training exercises rather than preparations for imminent attack. The assessment failure stemmed from flawed analysis that assumed Iran would not risk direct confrontation with a carrier strike group due to overwhelming American conventional superiority, an assumption that failed to account for game-changing impact of hypersonic technology. When Iranian forces executed the actual attack on April 3rd, using the same launch positions and timing patterns they had rehearsed for 2 weeks, American commanders initially believed they were observing another training exercise, delaying defensive responses by critical seconds that meant the difference between possible survival and certain destruction. The third category examines the tactical decisions that positioned the Ford within striking range despite known threat environment. The carrier strike group was operating approximately 87 nautical miles from the Iranian coast when the attack occurred, a position chosen to demonstrate American resolve and freedom of navigation in international waters. However, this position placed the Ford well within the 200-mile range of the Zircon system, effectively conducting target practice for Iranian missile crews. Alternative positioning options existed that would have maintained operational capability while increasing standoff distance beyond hypersonic missile range, but these options were rejected by strike group commanders who assessed that repositioning would signal weakness and embolden Iranian aggression. That assessment prioritized political symbolism over force protection, and the result was the single largest loss of American military personnel since September 11, 2001. The fourth category involves the communications breakdown that prevented effective damage control response after initial missile impacts. According to the after-action report, the first missile strike severed primary communication systems linking the bridge to Damage Control Central, while the second strike destroyed backup systems housed in separate compartments designed specifically to prevent total communications loss. Without functional internal communications, damage control teams could not coordinate flooding response or firefighting efforts, allowing uncontrolled fires to reach munitions storage within 90 seconds of initial impact. The third missile strike, which penetrated directly into the ship's nuclear reactor compartment, triggered automatic shutdown systems, but also released radioactive steam into surrounding spaces, forcing evacuation of engineering sections and preventing any possibility of restoring power for pumping operations. The carrier sank not because the hull damage alone was unsurvivable, but because the combination of communications loss, fire spread, and reactor compartment contamination created cascading failures that overwhelmed all damage control capabilities. The fifth category analyzes the rescue operation failures that prevented saving significant numbers of personnel who survived the initial sinking. Escort vessels in the carrier strike group, including 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers positioned between 5 and 12 miles from the ford, immediately moved to conduct search and rescue operations. However, Iranian coastal defense forces launched anti-ship missiles at the rescue vessels, forcing them to prioritize defensive maneuvering over rescue operations. 2 destroyers sustained damage from missile fragments, while the third exhausted its entire defensive missile inventory in the engagement. By the time Iranian attacks ceased approximately 40 minutes after the carrier sinking, darkness, fuel fires on the water surface, and the depth of the disaster site combined to make effective rescue impossible. Naval intelligence estimates that between 800 and 1,200 personnel survived the initial sinking, but perished in the water due to rescue operation interference, making Iran directly responsible not merely for the carrier destruction, but for what international law would classify as war crimes through deliberate attacks on rescue operations. The sixth category documents the institutional failures within Pentagon leadership that ignored warning signs and suppressed dissenting analysis. 3 separate classified reports filed between November 2025 and February 2026 warned that carrier operations in the Persian Gulf had become untenable in light of Iranian acquisition of advanced Russian missile systems. These reports, authored by senior analysts at the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and the National Security Agency, all recommended immediate withdrawal until defensive capabilities could be upgraded or alternative deterrence strategies developed. Pentagon leadership rejected these recommendations, with Defense Secretary William Morrison stating in a classified February 18 memorandum that withdrawal would constitute unacceptable surrender of American interests and encourage further Iranian aggression across the Middle East. The analysts who authored the warning reports were reassigned to non-operational positions, effectively silencing institutional resistance to the policies that led directly to this catastrophe. Now let me show you how these failures accumulated over time through a detailed timeline that demonstrates this was not a sudden crisis, but rather a predictable disaster that leadership chose to ignore. February 8, 2026. Russian cargo vessel Konstantin Simonov departs Novorossiysk, carrying confirmed military cargo destined for Iranian port of Bandar Abbas. February 14th. U.S. satellite imagery confirms delivery of 12 large missile containers matching dimensions of Zircon system transport crates. February 18th. Defense Secretary Morrison issues directive requiring all carrier groups to maintain normal operational posture despite new threat environment. February 23rd. Iranian state media broadcasts footage showing what experts confirm are Zircon missiles during military parade in Tehran. March 1st. USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group departs Naval Station Norfolk for scheduled deployment to 5th Fleet Area of Operations. March 15th. Iranian forces conduct first observed rehearsal launch using mobile platforms along southern coastline. March 18th. Naval intelligence issues assessment classifying Iranian activity as routine training with low probability of actual attack intent. March 22nd. Second Iranian rehearsal launch observed and again assessed as non-threatening. March 28th. Seventh and final rehearsal launch occurs using exact firing positions and timing that will be employed in actual attack 6 days later. April 1st. Ford Strike Group enters Persian Gulf through Strait of Hormuz, taking up station 87 nautical miles from Iranian coast in position designated Point Romeo. April 2nd, 14:30 hours. Intelligence analysts detect increased Iranian communications traffic consistent with pre-attack preparations, but assessment categorizes activity as response to American carrier presence rather than preparation for offensive action. April 2nd, 21:47 hours. Iranian coastal radar systems increase scanning activity, painting Ford's strike group with targeting radars for 97 continuous minutes. April 3rd, 03:30 hours. Iranian mobile launcher platforms move from concealed positions to pre-surveyed firing locations along coast. April 3rd, 03:42 hours. Iranian fire control radars achieve final targeting lock on Ford. April 3rd, 03:45 hours. 3 Zircon missiles launch in sequence from separate platforms. April 3rd, 03:47 hours. First missile impacts Ford's flight deck, penetrating 4 levels before detonating in aircraft maintenance spaces. April 3rd, 03:47 hours plus 2 seconds. Second missile impacts forward of island superstructure, penetrating to hangar deck and destroying primary communications systems. April 3rd, 03:47 hours plus 4 seconds. Third missile impacts engineering spaces, penetrating reactor compartment and triggering contamination alarms. April 3rd, 03:51 hours. Uncontrolled flooding reported in 17 separate compartments as bulkhead integrity fails from explosion damage and secondary fires. April 3rd, 03:54 hours. Forward section of Ford lists to 37 degrees as flooding overwhelms pumping capacity. April 3rd, 03:58 hours. Captain orders abandon ship as reactor compartment damage prevents any possibility of saving the vessel. April 3rd, 04:01 hours. Ford's stern section sinks, completing total loss of vessel. Notice the pattern that emerges from this timeline. Iranian forces conducted systematic preparation over nearly 2 months, rehearsing the exact attack profile they would eventually execute, while American intelligence consistently misinterpreted their intentions. The strike group positioned itself within optimal Iranian striking range based on political considerations that overrode tactical prudence. When the attack finally came, every defensive system failed simultaneously because hypersonic technology simply exceeded American capabilities, a fact that multiple intelligence agencies had documented, but Pentagon leadership refused to acknowledge. This was not a surprise attack in the Pearl Harbor sense of coming without warning. This was a predicted disaster that occurred exactly as analysts said it would, ignored by leadership that prioritized maintaining the appearance of strength over protecting American lives. The legal and international consequences of this catastrophe extend far beyond the immediate military defeat. Under international law, the Iranian attack constitutes an act of war, giving the United States legal justification for comprehensive military response, including strikes on Iranian territory, naval blockade, and potentially invasion. However, exercising that legal right requires public acknowledgement of the attack, which the Pentagon has so far refused to provide. This creates a bizarre legal situation where the United States possesses full justification for war, but cannot invoke it without admitting the catastrophic losses that would expose leadership failures and potentially trigger domestic political crisis. The Iranian interference with rescue operations, documented through communications intercepts and witness testimony from surviving destroyer crews, constitutes war crimes under the Geneva Conventions, specifically the prohibition on attacking shipwreck survivors attempting to surrender or seek rescue. International Criminal Court prosecutors could theoretically bring charges against Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders, but such prosecution would require cooperation from the United States government, which has shown no willingness to pursue accountability that would require acknowledging the disaster publicly. The domestic legal consequences focus primarily on the Pentagon leadership that ignored warnings and suppressed dissenting analysis. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, senior officers bear responsibility for decisions that unnecessarily endanger personnel, and the documented pattern of dismissed warnings potentially constitutes negligence rising to the level of criminal misconduct. Congressional oversight committees possess authority to investigate these decisions and refer findings to military justice authorities, But such investigations require political will that may not materialize if both parties prefer to maintain the blackout rather than expose the catastrophic failure to the American public. The families of the 4,790 personnel who perished possessed legal standing to file wrongful death claims against the Department of Defense, but such claims would require acknowledging that their loved ones are actually dead rather than simply deployed in classified operations, forcing the government to choose between maintaining the blackout and facing massive civil liability. Let me walk you through the most likely scenarios for how this situation resolves over the coming weeks and months. Scenario 1. Complete disclosure and accountability. In this scenario, Pentagon leadership concludes that the blackout cannot be maintained and proactively releases accurate information about the Ford's destruction, accompanies the disclosure with accountability measures including resignation of Defense Secretary Morrison and court-martial proceedings against senior officers who ignored warnings, and implements immediate strategic repositioning that withdraws remaining carrier groups from hypersonic missile range while upgrading defensive capabilities. This scenario allows American public to process the disaster with confidence that leadership is addressing the failures, provides closure to families of lost personnel, and potentially restores some measure of institutional credibility through demonstrated willingness to admit mistakes and impose consequences. However, this scenario requires leadership to prioritize transparency over political self-preservation, which contradicts every pattern of behavior demonstrated over the past month since the attack occurred, making it the morally correct option but the least probable outcome. Scenario 2. Selective admission with blame deflection. This scenario involves Pentagon acknowledging significant incident involving the Ford, but characterizing it as limited damage from which the vessel is recovering, attributing the attack to unprovoked Iranian aggression that justifies American military response, and deflecting responsibility for defensive failures onto mid-level commanders while protecting senior leadership. The selective admission allows government to prepare the public for eventual full disclosure while controlling the narrative framing, generates support for military action against Iran that shifts focus from American failures to Iranian aggression, and provides political cover for leadership by creating scapegoats at lower ranks. This scenario aligns with historical patterns of institutional crisis management and represents moderately high probability because it balances the need for eventual disclosure with leadership's desire to avoid accountability. Scenario 3. Prolonged blackout until forced disclosure. In this scenario, Pentagon maintains the current information suppression as long as physically possible, eventually faces forced disclosure through whistleblower leaks, foreign intelligence releases, or family pressure that breaks through media blackout, and scrambles to develop crisis response only after losing control of narrative timing and framing. The prolonged blackout allows leadership to delay consequences and potentially survive politically if other crises distract public attention, but it maximizes damage when disclosure inevitably occurs because the extended deception becomes its own scandal separate from the underlying military failure. This scenario represents moderately high probability because it requires no affirmative decisions, simply continuing current policies until they become unsustainable. Scenario 4. Strategic escalation to overshadow failure. This scenario involves Pentagon launching major military strikes against Iranian targets that shift public focus from defensive failure to offensive action, characterizing the strikes as justified response to unprovoked attack while minimizing discussion of American losses, and using the fog of war to obscure details about carrier losses in the larger context of regional conflict. The escalation strategy transforms defeat into the opening act of a larger conflict where ultimate American victory overshadows the initial losses, provides nationalistic rally effect that suppresses criticism of military leadership, and potentially achieves strategic objectives against Iran that justify the losses in hindsight. However, this scenario requires willingness to engage in major regional war as alternative to admitting failure, representing an extraordinarily dangerous course that could trigger broader conflict involving Russia and China if they choose to support Iran militarily. Based on everything we have examined, the documentary evidence of warnings ignored, the pattern of institutional suppression when confronted with dissenting analysis, and the political incentives facing current leadership, Scenario 2 represents the most probable outcome. Pentagon will eventually admit to significant damage while characterizing it as survivable, will attribute the attack to unprovoked Iranian aggression, while minimizing discussion of American positioning decisions that enabled the strike, and will identify mid-level commanders as responsible for defensive failures while protecting senior leadership from accountability. This scenario allows leadership to maintain positions while preparing the public for escalation against Iran that shifts focus from American failures to future American actions. The 30-day window during which the blackout can realistically be maintained is rapidly closing. We are now 33 days past the attack, and the logistical requirements of managing 4,790 missing personnel will soon make continued deception impossible. Family members are asking questions about why communications from their loved ones have ceased. Personnel administrators are struggling to process pay, benefits, and duty assignments for individuals who no longer exist. The physical absence of a $13 billion aircraft carrier from expected positions is generating questions from allies and partners who coordinate with American naval forces. Within the next 2 to 3 weeks, the accumulated pressure from these multiple vectors will force some form of disclosure, and the nature of that disclosure will determine whether American institutional credibility survives this catastrophe or suffers permanent damage from which recovery becomes impossible. Subscribe to this channel immediately and enable all notifications, because when the disclosure finally occurs, you will want to have the complete background that mainstream media will not provide. The next development in this story could break tonight, tomorrow, or next week, but it is coming, and you need to be informed when it arrives. I want you to participate in this investigation by sharing your assessment in the comments right now. Type "disclose" if you believe Pentagon should immediately release full, accurate information regardless of political consequences. Type "escalate" if you believe the appropriate response is major military action against Iran that renders the carrier losses acceptable in context of broader strategic victory. Type "resign" if you believe Defense Secretary Morrison and senior Pentagon leadership should step down immediately to allow accountability.